In today's video, we're going to lubricate the caliper slider pins on this vehicle and replace the brake pads. This is the rear brakes we're doing here. We're not going to change the rotor, but we will have to take it off in order to retract the piston back into the caliper. And in this vehicle here, this has the type of piston that we have to spin it to retract it. I have a video on using that tool, and I will put a link to that at the bottom of this video. Anytime we're retracting a caliper piston back, we're changing brake pads or anything like that, is we want to remove the cap off of the brake master cylinder, which is in kind of a tight spot here. First thing I'm going to do is loosen off my caliper slider pins here, even though the whole caliper itself has to come off, because I want to retract the piston to put the new pads in. So we're looking at this in reverse, so make sure you set your ratchet for counterclockwise to loosen. These shouldn't be too tight. Oh, sorry, I had to block the camera there. That's the top one. Bottom one, hopefully you'll see this down here. Make sure you get your ratchet on there nice and straight. Like I said, those shouldn't be too tight. I have the two slider pin bolts loosened off. I'm actually going to leave those in place for the moment. Now I'm going to loosen off the caliper mounting bolts. I actually don't have enough room to get a socket in there because of the emergency brake cable. Let's see if I can do this without knocking the camera over. And there's one. I didn't loosen them off beforehand because I wanted to just give you a rough idea of how tight those are. Let's see if I can. In the manual, it gives the foot pounds on them. And let's see here. There's the bottom one. So, as you can see, not all that tight. Working around your back brakes, I always like to use the emergency brake if I'm working on the front, so that there's no chance of the vehicle rolling. On the back brake system, we have to release the emergency brake, so you block your tires so there's no possibility of the vehicle rolling, but you can't use your emergency brake, because if you do, this caliper is going to grab onto the rotor. Anyways, I got the bottom caliper mounting bolt out. I have a couple of tie wraps hanging up here. I'm going to tie wrap this caliper there once I take this top bolt out. Sometimes you got to give the caliper a bit of a hit with a hammer or something to get it off, but in this case I just spun the rotor. It's not that tight. I gave the caliper a couple of taps with the hammer, got that off, and I just removed the slider pin bolts from here. We can see that the pads are in rough shape, particularly the inboard one. The outside one isn't too bad, but it usually is the inboard pad that wears, and we can see it's really worn here. The rotor, set that aside. Clean up the piston as best you can. These grooves are where our tool is going to fit into to rewind that piston back into the caliper. As I said, I have a video. I'll show you quickly how to use it, but I have a separate video on that if you need more detail. I wasn't able to hold the tool and retract the piston into the caliper. It's a pretty simple procedure. As I said, I'll put the link down below. You just match up the dowels on the tool with the grooves in the piston and turn it clockwise and push in at the same time, and then the piston will be like that and totally retracted into the caliper. I actually had to turn the piston back out a little bit because most of these systems will have, the pads will have something that will line up with the groove in the piston. So I had to turn that out a bit for that protrusion on the pad to fit like that. You're going to have to use very specific grease for anything around brakes. I don't do product placement. This just happens to be the one I'm going to use. It's good time now to put some in there where the pads are going to slide, and on the pads themselves on these edges to fit into those clips. Slider pins should come out relatively easy. Sometimes I'll take a box cutter knife and just run it along there, obviously with being careful not to cut the rubber if they don't spin like that. In this case, this one here, I might, nope, that one there, that one moves too. So all you do there, being careful not to break the boot, slide her out like that, and we're going to put some of that grease I just showed you onto those pins. Clean it off, clean off that old crappy stuff first. Take this one out also. I take the boot right off so we can clean that up good. Once I have the brake grease on the slider pin, I put the boot back on and make sure that goes up right to the end like that. Now I got both pins greased up. I'll slowly slide that in there because I want that excess grease to go up into the boot, so it'll be kind of saved in there basically. So just kind of slowly, some of it's going to come out obviously, but a bunch of it's going to go up into the boot itself. So gotta hold this, force that down. I might not be able to film this at the same time as I do this. We're looking to get this slippery rubber boot over the groove on the pin. I think you can see where I'm going with this. And I might have to use both hands. There you go. So basically just do that. As I say, you make sure that the boot on the top and the bottom is seated, and just do the same thing, oops, with the other side. Once I get them in there, I'll push them up and down like that, and you see what's happening there. I usually just very carefully take my box cutter knife and push it down, and that lets any excess air that's in there. But you got to be careful doing that, so you don't want to cut that boot. After you're done, if you let that excess air out of there, you should have something that's basically looks like that. There is a flat area on the caliper slider pins here and on the lower pin there. We want to mate those up with the flat area there and there. So you got to turn your pin to get that lined up. So now I can see that both of my flat areas of my caliper pins are married to the flat area on the caliper. At this point, I'm just going to hand tighten the bolts. Go back and forth. Tighten those slider pin bolts up a little bit so we can get our pads into place. Hopefully you won't run into this, but sometimes particularly these cheaper brake pads, you try to get them into place in the caliper and they are so tight you can't get them in. or if they do get them in, they're so tight they're probably not even, may cause you grief. So I've run into this in this case, and I just take some heavy grit sandpaper and wear them down a bit. Now, if you don't like doing that, you can always take your pads back, go get another brand, but I'm in the middle of this job, so that's what I usually do. Here I have both pads in place, and I had to do some grinding off of the tabs on both of these pads. They were both tight. I'm going to put the rotor in place. Then, with a little luck, there'll be enough room to put these. There we go. Sometimes these pads can be really tight. I'm not replacing this rotor, so it's worn a bit. Anyway, I'm just going to put my caliper mounting bolts in place here. They call for, in the book, 25 foot-pounds. So kind of like we mentioned about before, these generally aren't going to be really, they don't have to be snapping tight type of thing. And move that around a little bit. If this doesn't pop right in, I'm not going to make you watch me get this lined up. Let's see. Anyway, the top one in place, and now I'll put the bottom caliper mounting bolt in there. So at this point, pretty much done. I have our caliper slider pins tightened back up here, top and bottom, caliper mounting bolts. You can look up the torques if you want to. As I said, they're not snapping tight or anything. Put the cover back on the brake master cylinder fluid reservoir. So now we're going to pump the brakes and get some brake pressure back. Your brake pedal should return to normal once those new pads seat against the rotor. Once you're confident that the brake pressure has returned properly, which it is now to my system, you can take it for a test drive, and that's the end of this video.